All right, Dr. Layne Norton, it seems pretty odd that in the world of health and fitness, we're seeing a lot of people kind of pivot over to suddenly talking longevity when maybe, I don't want to say they're not the best people to talk about longevity, but none of us really know about longevity because not many of us are over 100 years old that are talking about longevity. So I just wanted to talk to you and kind of highlight maybe some of the potential things that people should be looking out for online in terms of like the longevity BS that's out there, because there's a lot of it. Where do we start?
For what it's worth, I did put a link down below for some lower sugar options through Thrive Market. Thrive Market's an online membership-based grocery store. You can skip through this if you want to. You absolutely can skip through it anytime. They're a sponsor on this channel, but I figured it's relevant because if you're trying to find processed foods that are a little bit cheaper, a little bit healthier, that you could actually have in your pantry. When I say processed, I mean air-dried chips or air-dried beet chips or beef jerky. It's still processed. But healthier, better for you options. So that link is down below, saves you 30% off your entire grocery order. So if you live in, say, Mississippi or Kentucky or Alabama or one of these southern states that's kind of tipping the scales, so to speak, but also has the high sugar intake, maybe it's easier to get some food delivered to you than it is to, say, try to find it at your local grocery store that may not have the best options. But either way, no matter where you live, it's a better option than a lot of the stuff you're going to find in the grocery store. So that link is down below, saves you 30% off your entire grocery order and a free $60 gift. So it's in the top line of the description. Just click on that little link for Thrive Market.
Yeah, I mean, obviously longevity is a difficult question to tackle because you have to rely on epidemiology because you can't do a 100-year randomized control trial, and tweak every little variable. Like, it's just not a reasonable expectation. And so, of course, the problem with epidemiology and cohort studies, and for those who aren't familiar, epidemiology is kind of, we look at this population versus this population, see what their characteristics are, and see who has more incidence or less incidence of whatever it is we're looking at. So, for example, we're looking at, this population, vegan versus low carb, incidence of heart disease, that sort of stuff. Or we look at, people who are obese versus non-obese and mortality, those sorts of things, right? So you look at different populations, you look at what happens. That's kind of what we call cross-sectional epidemiology, where you're looking at a sliver in time. And then you have what are called cohort studies, which is you have a section of people that you track for however many years. And it could be 5 years, 10 years, 20 years. And then you're looking at, okay, who gets whatever outcome you're looking at, heart disease, cancer, mortality, whatever it may be, who gets more or less of this, and what are the traits that are associated with that? Seems fairly straightforward until you consider that, people don't do like habits in isolation, right? People who, we call this healthy user bias, right? People who watch their diet more also tend to exercise more. They tend to drink less. So all these habits are kind of coupled together. So it can be very hard to disentangle this stuff. A great example is like diet soda. So if we look at some of the epidemiology studies with diet soda, you would say, oh, it's bad. It's associated with greater rates of obesity, higher risk of type 2 diabetes, all that. But when we do look at the randomized control trials, it's the opposite. People who drink diet soda in place of regular soda lose weight and get more metabolically healthy. So how do we explain that? Well, again, in the case of the cohort data, I feel like I have to sneeze. I'll keep rolling until I have to. In the case of the cohort data, what you're seeing here is kind of a reverse causation, which is what you're seeing is not the people who drink diet soda are developing these problems and diet soda is causing it. People who have these problems, obesity, type 2 diabetes, are more likely to try to diet, more likely to try to use diet soda. And so there is what the association is. And that's why you see the reverse in the randomized control trials. And just to give one more perspective on why that's important in terms of like randomized control trial, why we consider the highest quality of evidence. So again, if you just observe people, you don't do an intervention. Again, people who do one thing, they're more likely to also do other things. And we can't we can't, it's hard to control for that when you're just observing. Randomized controlled trials are important because that is where you are having people do an intervention. We're going to have you, like, let's say the diet soda example, we're going to have you drink diet soda or not drink diet soda, or we're going to have you drink cola or not, or we're going to have you drink water or not, like comparing these things. And we are randomly distributing people to those groups. And the reason randomization is important is because whatever inherent characteristics that might be attached to a person's habits, by randomizing, you can assume that those traits will be randomly distributed across those groups. So therefore, any outcome you see is most likely due to the treatment rather than some inherent characteristic along the group. Now, if you said, we're going to let you self-select whether you go into the diet soda or the cola group, well, the problem is people who are more health conscious, or let's say if you had cola, diet cola, and water, right? You might have the outcome of that study be, well, water was best. But we know from the randomized control trials, water and diet soda are pretty much the same. Diet soda actually, when you replace it for cola, may have a slight advantage, but it's because of appetite, not because of fat burning effect. But if you allowed people to self-select, you'd probably get people who were very healthy selecting into the water group because of their preconceived bias towards water, or just they don't drink diet soda or cola as much. And so now you can't be sure if your outcome is due to that or if it's due to the treatment. So that, again, that's why randomization is important. We don't care what group you want to go into, you're going into this one, right? Take, for example, like if we want to do a protein study on bodybuilders and we say, okay, you guys are going to the low protein group and you are going to the high protein group. All the bodybuilders are dropping out of that study. And they get randomized to the low protein group, right? Okay, so bringing that back to the longevity discussion, it's important to point out that we really are relying on cohort studies. And with the randomized control trials, what we're looking at is short-term surrogate markers, right? We're looking at metabolic health. We're looking at, blood lipids, these sorts of things. One of the kind of tropes that's been out there is that fasting is better for longevity. Now, I want to be clear. I think fasting could help with longevity, but as a means to control body weight. I don't think it has any real unique benefits. And if you look at the research data, really there's only one or two studies in mice, and then there's a few studies in like yeast and other things where they show like longer life cycle. All I know is there's plenty of animal studies that show stuff that don't pan out in humans. And if you look at if you look at the studies that are the most well done for longevity in animals, you probably want to look at the primate studies, which those were using caloric restriction, and they showed a 30% caloric restriction in primates extended these animals' lifespan. And those are obviously very close cousins to humans. People say, well, this mouse study showed an extended lifespan, same calories, just using intermittent fasting. And here's the problem with that. Rodents, if you're going to use an animal model, you have to pick the right animal for the model. Meaning, for example, rodents are actually a pretty good model for human protein metabolism. Most of the outcomes we see in rodents tend to translate to humans. But if you wanted to, or like pigs are a pretty good model for digestion for humans. But you wouldn't use, say cows for looking at an experiment about insulin sensitivity because cows are ruminants. They don't really use insulin and glucose, right? You'd get weird, funky data. So rodents aren't a great model for longevity because unlike humans and primates, rodents continue to grow throughout the course of their life. They don't really have their growth slows down, but it never really stops. Humans grow up till about 20, and then for all intents and purposes, their growth is done. I mean, you could argue that now humans grow past that, but that's obesity and fat mass. That's not actual growth pattern that we observe. And so also, if you're doing a 16-8 study in mice, well, keep in mind a mouse lives 18 to 24 months. 16 hours of fasting in a mouse, that's like 3 weeks in a human. So couple all those things together, and I just don't know what studies like that mean, right? Now, if we look at the primate studies, people say, okay, well, you want to calorically restrict. And I did animal research in graduate school. And so when people say calorie restriction, I know what that actually means in the lab. So they basically allow these animals free access to food, and then they measure how much they're eating, and then they restrict that by 30% or whatever percentage they want. Well, guess what animals do in captivity? They overeat, right? And so if you look at the growth charts in these primate studies, you don't see like a steady decline in body weight over time. You see, if anything, you see like a small drop in body weight for the first couple months, and then it plateaus. So what these studies are doing is not really lifelong calorie restriction, because you would die if you were calorie restricted for your entire life. They're just not becoming obese. That's what's happening. They're maintaining a normal or lean body weight. And so I don't want to say strongly convinced, but I feel pretty convinced that most of the longevity benefits from these different diets are simply by helping maintain a healthy body weight. I think there's many paths to Rome to get there. But if you look at like the hazard ratios, the odd ratios, when you're examining obese people, their risk of mortality, maintaining a lean body weight or a normal body weight explains the differences in these studies. Yeah. And so what I'll tell people is, if I'm looking at longevity, the stuff I'm going to tell you for, optimizing longevity is probably not going to strike anybody as like revelationary. But it's the stuff that we are pretty convinced works. And it is, don't become overweight or obese, maintain a normal, healthy body weight. And by the way, that doesn't mean ripped either. In fact, if you look at the mortality data, like the raw mortality data, actually, if you get below like 10 to 15% body fat, it actually is increased mortality. Now, I'm not convinced that that's an actual physiological thing. I think that people who get that lean and stay that lean are like usually very hardcore athletes, or they're extreme type people who, again, have other behaviors that are extreme alongside with that, right? So I don't know if it's like the low body fat that actually increases your risk of mortality. But I would say you don't have to get to the lean that most people think is lean, right? Normal body weight, 15 to 20% body fat, that seems to be perfectly fine. So that's one, don't become obese. 2, exercise, move your body. Regardless of body weight, exercise improves markers of metabolic health. It reduces the risk of mortality. It reduces the risk of cardiovascular disease. It reduces the risk of cancer. 3rd one, don't smoke. I mean, we know that people ask me about vaping. They ask me about marijuana. It's not necessarily, at least based on what I've seen and the studies that appropriately control for this, it seems to be that the smoke itself that you inhale is what is causing the issues. It's what damages the endothelium. It's what increases your risk of lung cancer. Because if you look at, for example, some studies looking at cigars, when they properly control for cigarette smokers and they control for cigars and people who don't inhale, you don't see increased risk of lung cancer, and sometimes don't see risk of cardiovascular disease either. The problem is that data is really hard to parse out, because a lot of cigar smokers also smoke cigarettes, and some cigar smokers inhale, which obviously you're still getting the same problems. But in general, don't smoke.
I want to come back to that, because I want to keep going, but I want to talk about nicotine in general a little bit and come back to that.
Yeah, so don't smoke. Next thing is, people freak out when I say this. Limit or abstain from alcohol, right? People say, why don't you just say abstain? Well, there are no solutions, there are only trade-offs. And so how do I weigh, for example, if somebody says, well, me going out and grabbing a beer or two with my buddies, like I feel so much more relaxed and I feel better. Okay, well, maybe the mental health benefit of you grabbing that beer with buddies is offsetting whatever small amount of decrement from a small amount of alcohol consumption. If you inject me with true serum and ask me, do I think that alcohol is a toxin at any dose? I don't, because you do have the ability to process alcohol at a certain rate. I think where you're going to get into negative effects of alcohol is when you're getting to the point where you're getting buzzed or you're getting drunk, because that means you've exceeded the capacity for you to process that alcohol. It's starting to get, that ethanol is starting to get into your bloodstream. And if you're getting the buzzed or drunk feelings from it, then it can also be doing some of the other things that you don't like, right?
Is there also, I mean, potentially an unhealthy user bias there?
For sure. Yeah. And that's, again, it's hard to like, if you look at the randomized control trials, looking at like short-term outcomes with like really moderate alcohol consumption, like 1 or 2 drinks at a sitting, you just don't, and they control for the calories in them, you just don't really see negative health outcomes in terms of blood lipids and blood glucose metabolism, weight loss or gain, those sorts of things. So I do get people who say, well, just abstain from drinking. I get that. On the other side, I also understand it's part of our culture. And again, how do I balance that versus like, okay, if somebody wants to have a glass of wine and they're relaxing, how do I balance that, right? Because my next bucket is mental health and psychological stress management. Now, I'm not saying use alcohol to manage your stress, but I'm saying whatever gets you relaxed, allows you to not like hyperfixate on problems. If you look at the data on psychological stress, man, like I talk about a lot in terms of pain. That's been the single biggest game changer for me, who struggled with lower back pain, hip pain for a better part of a decade. The biggest single game changer to me getting low pain and pain-free and winning national titles again has been psychological stress management. It has drastically reduced the amount of pain I have on a day-to-day basis. And people want to think that what happens up here doesn't affect here, and what happens here doesn't affect up here. And we now know that both affect each other. So I'll give you an example going both ways. They've shown people who have higher levels of psychological... Are you familiar with the ACEs score?
No.
Adverse Childhood Events Score. So 0 is basically like you had a great childhood, you were loved, love was given freely, you were never scared for your safety, you felt like you had autonomy over your body, you know, all that kind of stuff. Up to 10, which is you never felt safe, you had no autonomy over your body. Basically, you were probably mentally, emotionally, and physically abused, right? And you didn't, your basic needs were not met. There is a linear association between ACEs score and risk of cardiovascular disease, mortality, and cancer. Wow. What happens up here affects down here. And then if you look at a recent study that just came out, they took men with general anxiety disorder and major depressive disorder. They had them do 2 25-minute resistance training sessions a week for 8 weeks, 50 minutes of training a week. The effect size, which, you know, there's significance, which is a p-value, which is basically just tells you whether or not what you observe is due to random chance or if it's due to the treatment. But then there's what's called an effect size, which is basically how powerful was this effect? Like how meaningful was it? Because you can have something significant that's like a 1% difference, right? So like a 0.2 is considered a small effect size, a 0.5 is considered medium, and then a 0.8, anything above that is considered large. SSRIs are between like 0.3 to 0.5. I think at best I've seen like 0.8. 8 weeks, 2 times a week, 25 minutes a session for resistance training, had an effect size of 1.7.
Whoa.
Like massive.
That's
now, again,
crazy.
I'm not saying do resistance training in place of SSRIs. That's a conversation for your doctor, whether or not that makes sense. I think in some cases, a lot of times, maybe both, you know, but absolutely if you like suffer from depression, get moving. Point is though, what happens in the body affects the mind, and what happens in the mind affects the body. So how you talk to yourself, whether or not you ruminate on problems. I saw something great the other day, which was stop thinking about your problems. The rumination on your problems is actually the cause of a lot of your problems. And they actually find when it comes to the pain literature, people who think about their pain and fixate on it have more pain and recover slower from injuries than people who believe that they are strong and resilient and the pain is transient.
Dude, it's funny because, I mean, this is... You and I both dealt with low back issues for a really long time. And it took me, mine got to a point where it was finally having to occasionally take a Mobic, right? I didn't want to have to do that. But for me to continue what I was doing, I had to get somewhat out of pain and get mobile again. And I didn't want to have to do that, but I'd take a Mobic once a week. And the amazing thing is that the Mobic didn't heal me, but it got my mind off the pain that was constantly on my pain to the point where I was able to reestablish movement patterns. I was able to go through the motions. I was able to do the mobility work I wanted to do without constantly. And then it got to a point where it's not really needed anymore. It's right. And someone would say, well, it's just time. It may have been, right? But it's one of those things where I would wake up 3 or 4 times a night thinking about the pain. Yep. I would be in the pain throughout the day. Then it would affect my training. Then it would affect my mood because I wasn't training hard. Yep. So then I wouldn't have libido because I wouldn't feel good about myself.
It's a vicious cycle.
So then it affects the relationship. And then it's like, you know what? I'm by no way, shape, or form telling people to go and take a meloxicam. Like, that's not what I'm saying. I mean, you get the point. Point is that it got me out of that space, right?
Yep.
There probably could have been a million other ways that can help get you there. But it is amazing just not constantly wallowing in that pain, how that gets you out of it.
Yeah, and I mean, if I look back at when I had the worst pain is when I was going through the most stressful period of my life, And I think you can sensitize or desensitize yourself to pain based on the way you think about pain, your beliefs about pain. I mean, if you really want to go down the rabbit hole of this, it's very interesting. There was a study done, I think, I might butcher the details of the study, but I'll get the general stuff right. I think they did a skin pressure kind of test, a standardized pressure, right? And they had people rate it from 0 to 100, 0 being absolutely no pain whatsoever, 100 being like the most painful thing they've ever experienced. The average rating was somewhere like around 40 or 50, if I recall correctly. But the range was, this is like 300 people, the range was from 4 to 96. So for one person, virtually no pain whatsoever. For another person, almost the most painful thing they'd ever experienced. Same standardized pressure. So your pain experience, it all ties into your beliefs about pain. If you have an expectation of pain, it makes pain worse. That's why torture is so painful, because of the expectation. I mean, obviously, like, people will say, well, can you just believe that you're strong as cut your hand off and, No, like, there's limits to this stuff. But I can tell you, I have had times where I've been in such bad pain, or like I'm thinking about in December this past year. It was stressful. I had just been the tail end of a divorce, and I was in a squat session, and I remembered, like, got through my first set, and I was like, nah, we got to adjust today. So I went and did belt squats, whatever. But I didn't fixate on it. I didn't ruminate about it. Within 2 weeks, I had no pain again. I said, I'm strong, I'm resilient. I'm going to focus on getting enough sleep, which is my next point for longevity. Focus on getting enough sleep and de-stress myself. And I assume that this will work itself out. And it did. But the important thing is that, like, if you have those pain triggers, if you're in the middle of a pain trigger, you have to desensitize yourself to that. And the first part is not pressing on that pain trigger so much, right? Like, not just, well, I'm going to finish my workout, I'm going to go through. No, sometimes you got to back it off, or, just do walking or whatever you can do. It is important, like, if you can do some kind of activity, it's better than being totally sedentary. So mental health, psychological stress management is a major factor, in my opinion, for longevity. And I think putting that bucket in mental health, a lot of that is, and I'm glad more people are talking about this now, relationships. Sure. Like, it's hard to be stressed out and depressed if you have a lot of good relationships around you.
Diversify it. Yeah.
Right. If you have a lot of good people in your life who care about you, it's hard to be really stressed out all the time.
Yeah, you're not holding emotional stock in one person too.
Right.
And it's like, then you're dependent on, your happiness becomes dependent on one or two people, when it's like, A, it makes it harder to find it yourself, but B, like, if you've got 10 people that you can empty your bucket with and not burden 10 people or one person, right? You're able to diversify that.
Yep. And then I think I hit all the buckets, but then sleep.
Before we get into sleep, I just want to, like, Sardinia for a second. It's interesting on the mental health piece, because, like, if we talk about longevity, I've always found this interesting, and it's not heavily talked about. There's two of the categories that you talked about that hit with Sardinia. Obviously, Sardinia has a high concentration of centenarians, but they have the highest concentration of male centenarians, which I find extremely interesting. And there's two things. One, obviously, moderate amount of alcohol consumption with their wine, right? So there's all these little tangential things we could go down. Oh, polyphenols, this and that. Okay, but I think the bigger piece, specifically with the men, is, and you've probably heard this, the men they are, I don't want to say they're prioritized, but there is very established and set social time for men. And the men have some of the highest happiness scores in the world. And the men have an extremely high social system. And
bro time.
It's very interesting because above any of the, specifically the blue zones, because that's obviously what they were looking at, but I would imagine it's probably just beyond the blue zones. So considering they were only looking at the blue zones with this, but it was the only blue zone that has this high concentration of centenarian men, and common denominator, or I shouldn't say common denominator, but the outlying factor is that the men have an active social life, and there's specific time in the afternoon where the men get together, smoke cigars, drink their wine, and laugh. And it's I just find that really interesting because, okay, everyone's wanting to look at, and I think the Sardinian diet is friggin' awesome for sure. But at the same time, we're not talking about the real stuff. We only talk about the sexy stuff,
Yeah, I just had this thought while you were talking. I've never seen an interview with a person above age 90 where they're talking, and I think, boy, that person sounds really stressed out. I can't remember it. I in terms of being spun up or whatever, they just seem relaxed and happy. You know what I mean? And again, that's completely anecdotal, right? But if I think about the people who I've been around in my life who live to an old age, above say 85, most of them were pretty laid back people. Most of them weren't spun up about their problems all the time. I mean, again, what happens in the mind affects the body. And if you are, again, I'm probably venturing outside. No, not probably. I am venturing outside my area of expertise and giving a personal opinion. So I think it's important to put that down. But if you're spun up all the time and you're in fight or flight all the time, that takes a toll on your body, And if you look at chronic fatigue syndrome, fibromyalgia, and almost any autoimmune disorder, there's a very consistent association with psychological stress. And again, fibromyalgia, pain, one of the biggest things that reduces the symptoms of fibromyalgia is cognitive behavioral therapy. Right? Very interesting. You're thinking, okay, there's going to be some drug that they're going to put. No, it's getting people to stop stressing all the time, right? Because if your stress level is really high, there was a paper that talked about this. Basically, pain is kind of like a gate, and you can close that gate or you can open that gate based on what your state is, right? So lack of sleep and stress open that pain gate, makes it easier for you to have a pain experience. And if I think about when I've gotten spun up and stressed out, this happened a couple weeks ago. I was a little bit stressed out, and sure enough, here comes my back pain rearing its ugly head during training, So I'm going to watch a few sunsets. I'm going to spend some time with friends. I'm going to get enough sleep. I'm going to back off of my training a little bit, and I'll assume everything. And 2 weeks later, I'm fine, And so again, a lot of that's anecdotal, probably sounds like woo, but it is pretty well supported in the data that psychological stress is kind of the silent killer that nobody really talks about. And one of the things I actually say to people who get really caught up in the minutia out there, I'll say, hey, the amount of stress you're spending worrying about phytates and oatmeal or whatever the hell else you're worried about is probably going to kill you faster than if you got these little stupid things wrong. How many, when they interview people who are 100 years old, and maybe this is selection bias, but almost always I hear them say, yeah, I eat cookies, or yeah, I drink Dr. Pepper every day, or somebody's like, I smoked, I'm not saying that those things are good to do. I'm just saying that maybe being not so spun up all the time is a pretty big hack for living longer and being healthy. So that's one of the big buckets I put in there is mental health. And I never even really thought about it until probably 2 or 3 years ago, and even me, my own personal experience with pain and also my performance in gym and powerlifting. I mean, I left a very stressful relationship, and I'm not making any judgment statements. It was stressful for her too. But within probably 2 weeks, I'm in the gym and I'm like, what is happening? I was like making newbie gains strength wise. And I was like, wow, I'm not on eggshells all the time. I'm not spun up all the time. I'm not like freaked out all the time. My body's actually recovering now, because that recovery debt, that recovery burden, stress is still stress, whether it's physical or psychological. And I think it matters. And then getting into, I'll give you one more example with sleep. So they did a study looking at 4 hours sleep versus 8 hours sleep. And it was using people in the military and the incidence of acute injury. So people talk about injury prevention, right? And people like do stretches and all this kind of stuff. And reality is like the data actually doesn't support the idea that stretching prevents injury. I know this is going to piss off a lot of people out there, but it just is the truth. And 4 hours sleep versus 8 hours of sleep raised the risk of acute injury by 236%. So one of the best things you can do to reduce your risk of injury is to sleep enough and manage your psychological stress. So, I mean, again, like I look at like longevity as like focus on getting the big stuff right. Don't become obese, exercise regularly, or even if it's not going to the gym or whatever, just being outside, be active, live an active lifestyle. And whatever it is that you enjoy, I think resistance training is fabulous and is probably the best form of exercise there is, in my opinion. I'm a little biased, but something that gets you active. Like, for the love of, even if it's just walking your dog, man, you're doing so much better than most people out there. Then limiting alcohol, don't smoke, don't do hard drugs, those sorts of things, and then managing your mental health and sleeping. That stuff isn't sexy, but man, if you could do those 6 things, think about the number of people in the population that do those 6 things consistently. It's probably really small.
And everything you mentioned about, someone said, yeah, I occasionally have a Dr. Pepper. Yeah, if people are more laid back and they view things that way, there's also less risk of them being the kind of person that's going to use that as a coping mechanism, right? Because
exactly.
I don't have the data in front of me, but I'm pretty darn sure that a lot of times when it comes to overeating or possibly even selecting these things that, yeah, they're not good for us at Abundance. Maybe here and there it's fine, but they're choosing that as a coping mechanism for something else in their life, right?
And then you get into shame, binge eating, which is a lot more common than people want to realize. I was actually going to debate somebody probably like 10 years ago on clean eating versus flexible dieting, right? Mm-hmm. And this person was a clean eating proponent, but I knew that they had cheat meals every week, which were basically binge sessions. Okay. My opening argument, the debate never happened, my opening argument was he would post pictures of his cheat meal, and I added up the calories from ultra-processed junk food, and I added up what I ate during the week, just fitting it in moderation, and it turns out he was eating a little bit more in that one session, and I'm like, so let me get this straight. It's bad if I have it in moderation and fit it into my energy requirements, but it's fine if I binge eat on it. Please explain to me how this math works, right? And so again, like, that's why I think it's really unhelpful when people categorize foods as good or bad. Ben Carpenter, actually, I saw something on Instagram the other day with Ben where I think he did a really good job of explaining this. So he had 2 jars of marbles, right? One was like blue and one was green. And he said, okay, let's say the green is all ultra-processed junk food, right? And the blue is all whole foods, single source, that sort of, we would consider clean, right? A lot of people consider clean. He goes, if somebody's diet is all junk and they eat one good meal, he puts the marble in there, does it still look green? Yes, it's still junk, right? So, and everyone would agree with that, I think. Like, one healthy meal is not going to change your life. So why do we act like if we take one bad food, put it over here, everything's just going to shut down and we're going to go into it's toxic and we're going to, like, it's just ridiculous asymmetrical logic, And so That's why it's just, and a lot of times I tell people, you have to disconnect the intention of what people are saying from what the outcome is. And I'm so grateful I coached for so many years and worked with thousands of people to where I just saw how many people had disordered relationships with food, that their rules they had in their mind actually ended up causing the opposite effect, right? Where they would try so hard to avoid, and then when they broke, it was like, well, I've already screwed up, so fuck it, might as well just have as much as I possibly can, right? And so I'm not saying anybody should eat junk food. I think in general, avoiding it is probably a good guideline. But the idea that people say, well, if we could just get rid of ultra processed foods, that bullet's been fired, we're not putting it back in the gun. It's not going to happen, okay? Like, you can say whatever you want, and even if we could, there'd be other problems, because now you're putting several Fortune 500 companies out of business. It's going to tank the economy, and you're going to put hundreds of thousands of people out of work. So there's, no matter how you slice it, there's downsides to this. So I tell people, if you're avoiding ultra-processed food, your mentality around it matters in terms of why you're avoiding it. If you're avoiding it because it's calorically dense and you have a tendency to overeat on it, I think that's a reasonable reason to do it. But if you're avoiding it because it's bad and toxic, and if you have it, you're cheating, that sort of mentality tends to lend itself to like that black or white, all or nothing thinking, where people just go off the deep end, and it's like, this is not helpful for most people. So I think understanding the why behind the recommendation, that's also why I say I don't like hard rules. I like guidelines. Let me give you an example. If I say a rule, do not eat sugar. Well, fruit has sugar. So if you're saying sugar is toxic, I mean, the sugar in fruit isn't really different than the sugar in other places. So please explain to me how fruit sugar isn't toxic, right? Okay, but if it's a guideline of, well, try to limit your added sugars or sugars from ultra-processed foods because it's calorically dense and not very satiating, then you don't do stupid things like avoid fruit because you're scared of sugar, which, by the way, fruit is associated with decreased mortality, decreased cardiovascular disease, decreased cancer. So again, it's like the mindset behind why you choose to include or exclude or limit something is very important when it comes to all this stuff.
Especially with longevity, it's such a, at least with fat loss, there's a little bit more of like a mathematical spin that you can put on it. It's like, okay, yes, reduce consumption of this calorically dense food. Yes, you will lose fat. Like, it's a pretty fairly black and white discussion, right? Obviously a lot of room for debate there, but it's the matter of longevity. It's not so mathematically easy, right? No. It's not just, sure, we can say that losing some body fat is probably good, but there are probably a bunch of other variables that we don't even begin to understand. So we start putting these labels.
And genetics matter. Yeah. Genetics matter.
These different categories or labels of good, bad, this and that for longevity is a little bit, because it's just, there's just no way to back it up. But it's more so the psychological component that you're talking about that skews the data completely. And when I say data, I mean figurative data, not real data, right? Like, once you get into that territory, it's a whole different world. And you realize, wait a minute, I've been like a frog at the bottom of a wishing well, and like that little circle of the sky is what I've seen as the sky, right, my whole life. And then all of a sudden this opens up and you're like, holy, there's like way more going on, right? There's way more going on. From the fat loss discussion, sure, we can distill it down to some more basic things. But even then, who knows, right? It's probably more. But it gets increasingly frustrating, because I feel like people are interested in longevity right now because there's a lot of pain, and there's a lot of like people wanting to grab something that's a little bit uncharted. And I think people are tired of chasing some of the body composition stuff that they've been chasing for years. And like social media accelerates everything at such a warp speed that people are just kind of burnt out on that. So they're starting to go a little to the next thing. Okay, well, now I want to look at longevity. So then you have a lot of people that kind of take advantage of that. And that's a world that I just don't think that's fair. Like, if you're passionate about living long and passionate about living healthy, then great. Like apply these things you're learning and seek out like growth and learning. But when you go the other way and you start creating these toxic mindsets of being fearful of everything, then it's okay to have a healthy avoidance of things. But when you start developing this like internal fear all the time, it's only going to make you miserable.
Yeah, and I mean, I don't know him personally, and I'm sure he's a perfectly nice guy. I was watching Brian Johnson on Dr. Mike, and I thought Dr. Mike asked the question that I was waiting for somebody to ask him. He said, "You spend so much of your day thinking about how not to die. When do you actually enjoy your life?" Like, I don't know about you, but I don't really want to live to 120 and have spent that whole time trying not to die. Like, I want to actually like enjoy my life. And if it means it's a little bit shorter, I mean, okay, but I don't even necessarily think it will be, because again, I think the psychological stress tied up in that of always looking for something and really getting to the minutia. And I mean, some of these treatments that people are recommending, I mean, not only do they not have data to back them up, they're completely and utterly untested. You're just as likely to shorten your life doing some of this stuff. And so, again, I mean, I think for me, you can look at it one of two ways. Some people might say, well, that's very trailblazing, and at least there's somebody out there doing it. I understand that. I think that the danger becomes when you're propping it up to people and it's being presented as, I am going to live this long. Here are the things I'm doing. Oh, by the way, you can buy my whatever. And so I think that's the danger of it, is when it's being presented as something that, like the fasting longevity, people act like this has been a proven thing. It's not even close to, I wouldn't even say that the evidence. So when I say fasting, I mean fasting outside of its ability to control your body weight. Any benefits beyond that, I would say at best the evidence is very weak. And I would almost say there's little to no evidence. And so again, unfortunately, because social media, people tend to gravitate towards really extreme messaging and kind of sexy stuff. I made this comparison the other day. I said, if traffic is just going by and you're sitting by the road, it's not very interesting. When it's flowing like it's supposed to, it's not very interesting. But if a car flips over, catches on fire, and explodes, everybody watches, right? So what tends to get attention on social media is when people are saying stuff that's very outlandish, very black and white, very strong statements. That's what gets attention, because whether it's right or wrong, it's kind of like watching a train wreck, right? Whereas if people are saying things like, well, this probably matters, but in the context of this, that's just the traffic flowing. Mm-hmm. You're not going to notice it. And so I think that's where some of this stuff gets skewed, where people think, oh, well, this thing has been proven, when in reality, not even close.
All right, Layne, so one more thing, because I promised I'd come back to it.
Yeah.
The nicotine piece, just in general, because it's kind of funny. We saw Dr. Gundry get smoked pretty bad online for talking about basically condoning cigarettes. And I think it was a very distasteful way that he went about that. I think I kind of understand what he was.
Actually, can I jump in there real quick? So this is why it's very important to understand that cherry picking is very prevalent. I can make an argument that smoking is good for you. If I look at, I do this in a talk, I pull up this forest plot, which is basically a forest plot, has a center line. To the right of the line is basically however far each individual study is to the right of the line indicates an increased risk of adenocarcinoma in this meta-analysis I was looking at. To the left would be a protective effect, right? There's like 50 studies in total, and almost all of them are to the far right of the line, right? And the overall effect is like a 300 or 400% increased risk in adenocarcinoma from smoking. But there are two just to the left of that line. So I could cite two studies and say, smoking doesn't increase the risk of adenocarcinoma. In fact, it actually might be slightly protective. And smoking decreases the risk of Parkinson's by 30 to 40%. And by the way, that's very consistent in the literature. The literature on smoking shows, or the literature on Parkinson's shows, that one of the strongest predictors of protective effects against Parkinson's is smoking. but I'm cherry picking. And I'm also not couching with the fact that, oh, by the way, these 48 other studies show a really drastically increased risk of adenocarcinoma, also lung cancer, also cardiovascular disease. But if you want to push a certain narrative, you can always find things to support whatever narrative you want. And that is why scientific consensus, the consensus of the data, is so important. And that's why we don't just make, if you're a good scientist, you don't just make big swings in your recommendations based off of 1 or 2 studies, because let's wait till 10 or 20 come out and let, like if I see a study come out that's kind of interesting and sexy, my first thought is, yeah, wake me up when they have 10 more that show the same thing, because that's the replication is the mother of all science. So he is correct that smoking is protective against Parkinson's, but you'll probably die of lung cancer or cardiovascular disease before you get Parkinson's.
Exactly. And, there could be some reasons, I don't know what particular study he was referencing, but I know there's a couple of them. But when you come back to the common theme that people were talking about in regards to that video is, well, yeah, I'm seeing a lot of stuff on nicotine for longevity and this and that. So that's what I wanted to come back to. Because first I'll underscore the fact that I wholeheartedly agree that smoking is not good. I lost my father to lung cancer. Like, smoking is not good. That being said, nicotine has some interesting data on it. I don't know where I stand completely on nicotine. We've got Zyn pouches out there. We've got people now, popping them all the time just because there's a seeming longevity benefit, but I don't know if I'd go quite that far. I did some content on it, and my ultimate consensus on it was I don't know, but here's what I'm seeing. What's your take on nicotine, even nicotine pouches?
Yeah. So it's interesting. One of my good friends, he used to have Zyns all the time. Like, it would tell you, yeah, I've gotten to the point where I'm kind of dependent on this, and actually ended up weaning himself off of it because he didn't like being dependent on it. But he was using it for the nootropic effects, which nicotine actually is, in the literature, pretty consistently improves cognitive function. When I first met, I said, aren't you worried about XYZ? He goes, dude, you're the scientist. Haven't you looked into this literature? And I'm like, and I actually hadn't really. And then I started looking in the literature, and I'm like, oh, again, most of the data on lung cancer, any kind of carcinoma, cardiovascular disease, it doesn't seem to be an effect of nicotine. It's the smoke, because if you look at people who smoke marijuana, similar increases in the risk of cardiovascular disease and lung cancer. That's one of the things I'll tell people, because I'll say THC doesn't seem to have long-term decrements, like the molecule THC. But if you're getting it through smoking, that's not good. Like, smoking's not good. And even like vaping appears to not be as bad as like regular smoking, but still not good either. Just bringing smoke into your lungs and getting it into your system.
It just seems inherently wrong.
Yeah.
That just seems bad.
Yeah, it seems to, whether it's the smoke, the tar, some of the chemicals in there, damages the endothelium and increases the risk of lung cancer and other cancers as well. So, as far as nicotine goes, the data seems to be kind of similar to caffeine, to be honest. Like, you can find some studies that associate nicotine with like negative health outcomes, but again, like, it's hard to disentangle the unhealthy user bias, right? People who get more nicotine, usually not getting it through Zyn pouches, they're usually getting it through smoking, right? Yeah. So if you look at the randomized control trials, the human data, it seems to be a stimulant kind of similar to caffeine in terms of the cognitive function. So I don't personally use nicotine. I'm more of a caffeine junkie myself, but it doesn't seem to have a lot of the negative downsides that have been attributed to it. The negative downside of nicotine in combination with smoking is the nicotine can get you, addicted to the feeling that it gives you and the cognitive benefit and the cognition benefits of it. And so if you're getting that through smoking, people end up developing, they form that habit. And then there's other things too, where, people who smoke, they have a kind of a oral fixation. Also, nicotine is a pretty powerful appetite suppressant as well. So people, often smoke, or not often, but some people smoke to avoid eating So all that stuff. But nicotine itself, I'm not an expert in this realm, so I'm happy for any experts to correct me, but I haven't seen strong evidence that it's like really, really bad for you the way smoking is actually bad for you.
Yeah. Like if you look at, like caffeine technically isn't addictive, right? It is addictive in the sense, but if you look literally speaking, it's just did a video on this, like it's not, although it has what is that? Not a withdrawal score, but essentially like a measurement of withdrawal symptoms that would almost make it seem as though it's addictive. Mm-hmm. It's not literally addictive like a street drug.
Right.
Do you know if that's the case for nicotine or not? I have no, is nicotine literally addictive as in it's affecting D2 and like with dopamine receptors? Is it?
I actually don't. Yeah, I actually don't know that. I do know that, people can get withdrawal symptoms. And I definitely have noticed that with caffeine. Like if I cut caffeine cold turkey,
for sure, yeah.
Like headache.
No, that's real. It's
fatigue.
Withdrawal is real. Yeah.
Brain fog. So there's data to back that up, and then I've experienced that personally as well. I don't know about nicotine because I've never really used it. I haven't really looked into that data, but I would suspect that it's probably similar.
Yeah, and I know people are talking now about potential like mitochondrial benefit to nicotine and like a longevity effect. And again, I can only speak from what I've seen, right? And the data is interesting, but it's almost exclusively, I think there's like one real human study. Like there's nothing, so it's not exciting. And I do know, although when you look at metabolic studies in rodents, like some of the stuff is interesting, but as you mentioned, like wildly different metabolisms in many ways. So it's hard to take the same type of study, especially when you start looking at, there's some fat loss stuff associated with their grand adipose tissue. And like we know that rodents have significantly more, and it's a more important part of their life.
Much more regulatory in rodents.
Yeah. So although it's interesting, I wouldn't go so far as saying it's promising, but it's something that's like, okay, this is like, I'm not going to sit here and poo-poo it and say that like, I think Zyn pouches are really bad or deleterious. I think that so I kind of have an even stance on it, but I was very curious your opinion on it.
Yeah. I think my takeaway from the data I did look at, and it's been a couple years since I really dug into it, but my kind of takeaway was, oh yeah, this stuff isn't nearly as bad as I thought it was. And it seems to be similar to caffeine.
Yeah.
So, and again, like, possible, maybe some of the decrease in the risk of Parkinson's could be attributed to the nicotine in smoking. Yeah. But again, if you're going to, just like I say, if you like THC, get it through edibles. Don't smoke it. And if you like nicotine, get it through pouches or something like that. Don't smoke it.
Yeah, I'm with you on that, man. Well, Layne, where can everyone find you, man?
You can find me at my website, biolayne.com, and then my Instagram is kind of my digital business card. So you can go to @biolayne, and I put up a bunch of educational content, debunking content, all that kind of stuff. And I'm BioLayne on pretty much every social media.
Right on, brother. Thanks, man.
Thank you.